Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IAPP workshop on privacy, security, and compliance in the cloud. My name is Brendon Lynch. I am Microsoft's Chief Privacy Officer, where I've been for the last 12 years. Microsoft and the IAPP have had a long history. We were one of its first members 15 or so years ago. We were one of the founding funders of the certification program for privacy professionals, and we've done many partnerships with them along the way. I personally served on the board of directors of the IAPP for a five-year term, including being chairman in 2013. So for me, it's wonderful to be back here, wonderful to have a great group of privacy and security professionals together to talk about the cloud and everything that we need to do to ensure that we have the trust and confidence in moving to the cloud and leveraging the cloud for all the wonderful things we can. A quick rundown of the afternoon. I'm going to give some opening remarks and take some questions from you. So begin starting to think about what questions you may have. We're then going to have Doug Miller, who's an industry expert, go deeper into the cloud and the promises and perils. We'll then hand over to my colleague at Microsoft, Greg Brown, who's a standards expert, who will give us a good sense of the important role that cloud standards play in the cloud, both the present and in the future. Before hearing a really compelling case study from Jenna Holden at Taser about how they leverage the cloud for what you'll discover is very sensitive information. And then we'll wrap up. So with that, I thought I'd begin and make a few comments. And before we dive into the cloud, which you'll be spending the bulk of the afternoon on, I thought I'd provide a broader context to begin with. And it's really just about all the change we see in the world today. There are new ideas every day that really are off the back of the new technologies that we're dealing with. This time and this era that we're in is what the World Economic Forum dubs as the fourth industrial revolution. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. I thought I'd first back up and say, what were the first three? Well, the first industrial revolution began about 250 years ago. And it was where mechanized production happened for the first time. It was leveraging water and steam power. And if you think about humanity up to that point, the fastest transportation, for example, was the horse. So when the steam engine came along, it was obviously very revolutionary, and it did have a big impact on industrial production as well. The second industrial revolution really brought mass production and assembly lines, and it was heavily influenced by the advent of electricity and the broader adoption of that. And then the third industrial revolution, which we've been in for the last couple of decades, or a few more, has been about electronics and IT and its impact on further automating production. And so that's where we are and where we've come from. And what are the key characteristics of this fourth industrial revolution we're in? And beginning to be in. And it's really the confluence of three broad spheres of capabilities: the physical, the biological, and the digital. And it's not just advances in each of these individually, it's how they interact with each other, about how the digital supports the biological, and so on. The physical is everything from new materials through to autonomous vehicles, 3D printing, robotics, and the like. The biological is very much about genetic testing and genetic engineering. And not just will have impact on human health, but also on agriculture and livestock more broadly. And then the digital, a wide range of things, but it includes advanced data analytics, quantum computing, and the like. And so the World Economic Forum says that it's the confluence of these things and the pace of innovation that will come from the combinations of these things. And one of the interesting things about it all, the thing that underpins all of these three is the cloud. The cloud is the new infrastructure for our world. And so that's why it's such an important topic, I think, for this workshop and this day, is recognizing the degrees of change that are undergoing and the important and crucial and fundamental role that the cloud plays. Here are a few examples. These are just articles which you can't read from the back, I'm sure, from the last month. These are just breakthroughs in these domains over the last month. So the one on your far left is autonomous driving, and a software company that has now rolled out the first fleet and the first pilot of driverless taxis. It's in Singapore. In the middle, from University of California, Berkeley, a breakthrough which is a sensor the size of a grain of sand, which can be implanted in your body and can detect the electrical impulses from muscles and nerves. And it's sort of powered by and read by ultrasound. And so you could imagine the real-time ability to be able to monitor muscle nerve activities, organs, which will have massive breakthroughs. And it'll certainly replace these bands that we have on our wrists if you're so brave as to have these things implanted. And then on the far right is the creation of the artificial atom using graphene. And its promise in the quantum computing world is supposedly going to be transformational. So these are just three small examples of recent things but they really just show, I think, the types of breakthroughs that are happening with the confluence of these technologies, also the underpinning of the cloud. As you might imagine, at Microsoft, we have a lot of examples of these things. One of my favorites of how we're bringing cloud power and data analytics to help change the world is this example from Spain. It's from the Drummond Syndrome Foundation, and it's using the next generation genetic sequencing in the cloud to really advance and speed up the time to diagnosis of diseases so that patients can get the right treatments early, not get the wrong treatments, and deal with situations like that. This one had an interesting background. It started by a little boy in Spain called Sergio, and his situation was that at 6 months old, he started having seizures. And many visits to hospitals, all sorts of testing gene by gene to try and work out what was the underlying disease causing this. And they did discover and diagnose this in about 8 months' time. And believe it or not, 8 months is actually quite fast for these types of diseases. There's a lot of complexity. Sometimes, it can be a couple of years of experimentation of different drugs and all sorts of things to actually diagnose what's going on. Sergio's father happens to be a Microsoft employee in Spain, and he got together with a few colleagues and started this foundation and started to think about how we might be able to leverage the cloud and transform this type of diagnosis in the future. And that's essentially what happened. There's 40 terabytes of data they needed to put in. The amount of processing it takes to work through these things, what used to take years can now be done in a month. And it's rapidly sped up the diagnoses of not only Drummond syndrome, but a range of other diseases as well, and has a lot of promise. So that's one example that's in the healthcare space. But there are many examples, and I'm sure you've all got your own in your own industries about how technology is transforming and enabling breakthrough advances. When I think more broadly about this and talk to my counterparts around the world and various industries and organizations, one thing is in common in all of this is that data is driving innovation. Yes, it's the computing power and the hyperscale cloud and all these things help, but a lot of innovation is off the back of data. And as privacy and security professionals, that's obviously very pertinent to our jobs. Understanding the value side of this, of how important it is to advance societies, advance individual capabilities, at the same time as managing the downside risks that come with data. But if you think about it, it's increasingly the digital world, the devices we have, the interactions we have that increasingly have a digital component. We are essentially, as individuals and organizations, creating vast amounts of data, which provide all this promise. But at the same time, there's some serious considerations for security and privacy and compliance. It's all cloud-based increasingly, and we'll talk more about that a lot today. And it's all industries. One other example I use, which resonated well in my homeland of New Zealand, where I grew up. Both of my parents were dairy farmers, but even the dairy industry is getting transformed through technologies. So I'll give the short version of the story here, but you can imagine cows walking around with pedometers on, and then a lot of data analysis happening in the cloud in the back end and sending information back to the farmer, and the ability to actually get early diagnosis of disease because of the way that the cow's movements change. Very importantly, getting early indication of the reproductive cycle about to begin so that they can actually do the artificial insemination at the perfect time and really increase the reproduction, which is crucial for not only milk but growing the herds. Even to the point where it's so scientific and looked at the data that they could determine the right time to inseminate to increase the probability of a female, which is obviously what they want more in dairy farming as well. So that's an example of how one of the most primitive industries that we've had over time is also being transformed by digital technologies and by the cloud. More broadly, in thinking about things specific to security and privacy, I've talked about the cloud adoption. Organizations all over the world are recognizing the transformational strategic and economic benefits of moving to the cloud, and so it's happening at a very fast rate. We've also, of course, got the advent of machine learning and advanced analytics, again powered by the cloud, as a key trend in our space, and it's enabling things like more personalized experiences. I think that when we look at the world and we look at all these vast opportunities that technology is providing us, it almost seems like it's unconstrained. But one constraint that we have is human time and attention. And so we're all seeking to be more productive with our time, to have our experiences more personalized, to basically make it more efficient to get things done. And we're just at the beginning, but we're seeing in the individual space, digital personal assistants, and I expect that we'll see just a lot more of that. People are going to want to use it. They're going to opt into it. There's a lot of sensitive data that can be collected through it. So it's important for us as privacy and security professionals to really think through how we do that in a way that builds trust and mitigates risk and enables compliance. Another big trend in the space is with all this data, there's no surprise that regulators want to have a say. And we're seeing a wave, and I believe even more, of greater regulation around data. One key example right now, which I'm sure will be topical here at the IAPP over the next few days, is the general data protection regulation in Europe. It has more onerous requirements and more significant consequences of getting it wrong. I think that and other things will lead us to a new era of information management. We're increasingly going to be looking for our information management systems to be able to automatically understand and enforce policies and rules around data, including not just who can have access, but how it can be used. So I think that those are a number of areas of technology disruption, but also areas where we can use technology to our advantage to help us in information governance. So switching to the cloud, I thought I'd provide a few perspectives from Microsoft as an example of a major cloud provider in the space. One thing that's inherent in this quote from our CEO, Satya Nadella, is that we recognize that people and organizations will not use technology that they do not trust. And so for us, it's a business imperative to build trust and confidence in the cloud and to partner with our customers in doing that. So we make these series of commitments. We make a wide range of investments to enable that. We're very focused on what are the standards and practices and how can we demonstrate those in ways that will give you confidence, give you the information you need. What can we do to collaborate with industry and with regulators to help raise all the boats, to help build confidence in the broader cloud ecosystem? And really, as a company, we're in your shoes too. We've got a lot of exposure to laws and regulations around the world. We operate in many, many countries, and we've got our own rigorous compliance needs, and we apply the same in the way that we do it. So that's sort of the commitment from the top down. Now, what do we do next? How do we sort of unpack that concept of trust? What does it mean day to day in our investments to help? And it's across these 4 dimensions: security, privacy and control, transparency and compliance. So the commitments, of course, to implement the strongest security procedures and controls and get all the certifications to verify that we have that ensure that we're safeguarding your data. Privacy and control are bundled because it's about how can we give you control. Yes, it's limiting use and it's having conversations around liabilities and all those sorts of things, but it's very much about how can we empower you through our services to have control over how the data is used and who has access to it. Compliance, I mentioned before, we focus a lot on achieving all the certifications that our customers demand of us, and helping thereby you to be able to comply with your needs, and to be very transparent. Trust is always built on transparency. Is that saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant? I think it's especially true here, and there's so much that we and other cloud providers have published to really live up to that principle of being clear and transparent. And we're trying to do that in as clear and plain language as possible and tailor the content for different audiences. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what we're doing specifically for the security and privacy professionals. So, in fact, I'll start that right now. You have a vital role. You all know, I bet that you play a vital role in your organizations around data generally. On one hand, you want to be in a position where you're helping your organization enable the use of data, to drive that next wave of innovation, to delight your own customers. And at the same time, you want to manage that risk, and you're responsible and accountable for helping manage that risk for your company. So you're depended on, and I probably can't say enough about that. I know that in my own role when I think about supplier relationships and data crossing trust boundaries to other organizations, that we spend a lot of time and focus on how do we ensure that we have confidence throughout the data life cycle and all its movements that the rules are being upheld around its use. And so it probably goes without saying that you have a crucial role. There are a couple things that we do to help you with that. And first of all, it's how we actually approach our cloud services. And that's in a number of areas. I talked about standards and regulations. We actually have a history of being often the first in industry to achieve a particular certification to a new standard. And we've seen that whether it's the first to get European model clauses, whether it's the first to get certified to ISO 27018, which is a cloud privacy standard. Those are examples of that, and you can expect that from us, that we're always going to be on the forefront, always looking around the corner, listening to our customers, understanding what they might want next, and going there. We've got thousands of people, security and compliance professionals around the company working on this. We do a lot of work to actually stand up for the legal rights of customers. We've been in the position recently of suing the US government 4 times for various things, largely around the ability to provide more transparency, to be able to inform our customers more about what sort of law enforcement access is happening to data or requests that are coming in is an example of that. So that's what we're doing in our own actions. And then finally, and then I'll open up for some questions, is we've created this new portal, particularly focused at the legal and compliance professionals, to help them sift through all the large amounts of data and have it tailored for them by industry, by region, about how we can help you with this. The website there is microsoftcloudassurance.com. And you'll find a lot of those resources there. We're also partnering with organizations to do training, and we're doing a number of customer roundtables to listen and understand your needs. This is an example, I think, of one of those partnerships of where we're reaching out to the community and providing information and bringing a broad set of perspectives together like we have in this workshop today. So those are some of the things that we're doing, some of the broader context that I see for the way the world's changing, the crucial role that the cloud plays, the crucial role that privacy and security professionals and compliance professionals play, and some of the things we're doing to help. So with that, I'll pause and I'll open up and take any questions you may have. We've got a microphone up here, so when you're ready, raise your hand and we'll take a question.
Just raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic. Unless you feel like shouting.
So
One hand.
you talk about genetics as...
Can you do that?
People in the back can hear you as well.
You talked about genetics as the science that you're primarily concerned with. Are there other areas?
It wasn't per se that it's an area I'm concerned with. It was more that it was an area where we expect a lot of breakthrough. And it's the whole genetics world, because they can now leverage the power of the cloud for these advanced computations over large sets of data and derive new insights that are really going to advance human health, as well as I mentioned, agriculture and livestock and the rest of it. So on one hand, I'm saying I didn't raise it necessarily as a concern, but that said, our genetic information, of course, is arguably some of the most personal information that we have, and so we need to ensure that all of this is happening, like everything else, that we put in place the appropriate security and privacy protections around it, so that we get all the good out of it and mitigate the bad.
Hi, Jacob Springer from IAPP Laboratories. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, sort of like the trends towards the cloud, no question, but also the trends from countries to localized data, and how it sort of like tried to meet those sometimes conflicts.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. There are certainly, as we all know, concerns often about where is the location of the data. In addition to, irrespective of where it is, how is it protected, who has access, and all the rest of it. And I think we're seeing I expect a settling out eventually. I think there are certainly some countries are saying, at least for certain data sets, that we want to have that maintained in our region or our country. At the same time, when you look at the pure sort of economic and agility benefits that come from the cloud, they often benefit from data movement and from data to be able to move around and be combined with other data sets and the like. And naturally, that will mean often crossing a national border. So those tensions are at play. I think that there'll be, as I say, a settling out. There's probably going to be, certainly us and others, are looking to see what we can do from a regionalization of our cloud infrastructure. We have, at Microsoft, I think, more regions than any other right now. I think it's 24 regions or something like that around the world where organizations can move to the cloud and have their data stay within the region. For example, in Europe, because we've got data centers in Dublin and Amsterdam and building more out in other places, you can then enable that kind of thing. So I think we'll see a combination. At the same time, there's a big public policy debate about, should it matter? Can we establish new norms and treaties and the like that sort of makes the border relevant in terms of being able to uphold people's rights? So if your rights get upheld no matter where the data is, based on your own laws locally, that's certainly I think, an intriguing prospect, and one that we're, in our public policy discourse, exploring to see how that sort of thing might work. Because that should, if that could come about, that would, in a lot of ways, I think, take away the concerns and the need for more sovereign or localized clouds.
Hi,
Yes.
Suzanne Ames Research Center. This kind of is a good follow-on to that question. How has regulation affected how how Microsoft approaches cloud services, and if it has what? An example.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think, one of the things to begin with is that when we first began in cloud services, and arguably largely still today, there's not cloud-specific regulations. So it's all about how do the existing laws and regulations apply to this new paradigm. And we see this time and time again with a new technology. When we first introduced location-based services, how do we apply the existing law to this new thing? And the same was true for the cloud. For us, it actually began 20 years ago because that's when we had Hotmail, and the consumer cloud offering for the first time, where from a privacy standpoint, even though the cloud today is very different, it's hyperscale and it's got all of these, all these other capabilities that come with it. But the concept of putting sensitive personal information on servers that are under your control, in a cloud environment, and access it through a web form, website, was back then. And so right at that moment, I wasn't at the company at that time, but it was all about how do we apply our current rules and policies and everything that are designed to meet the laws and regs around the world for this new thing. What are the controls we should put in place? What are the consents we should get? What are the informed choices that people have? How can we enable people to control it, to be able to delete their email, all that kind of thing. And then that sort of flows through. So I think it's a fairly generic answer, but generally speaking, it's about really, because a lot of these laws and regs are principles-based, it's about applying those principles to the new thing. And that's why you see our trusted cloud principles being those core things: transparency, control, security, the bedrocks of all privacy and data protection law since it began.
Isn't that specific? Federal requirements for all IT, if you're going to work with the federal government.
Yes.
Is a National Institution of Standards in Technology. Yep. 800-53 is kind of known throughout the federal government. And the federal government is really only a small part of the total customer base that you have. But it has affected how the government approaches, cloud services. So I was wondering how regulations affect how Microsoft approaches cloud services.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good follow-up, because I stopped short of going there. But I was talking in the more general case, you apply the principles. But of course there are going to be laws and regs and rules and things that come out that are specific, whether it's specific to a vertical industry sector, specific to a certain country, where they do get more prescriptive. And that is key, to the way that we provision and operate our cloud services. And when Greg comes up, I'm sure he'll explain more about the vast, amount of things that we have to deal with like that. But the approach we take is to establish what's that common layer of controls that we need in place to meet all these things. Sometimes a new requirement will come in, which means we've got to add a new control. Often, it's a flavor of something else that we've already got a control for. We might just need to demonstrate it in a different way to meet that particular rule or for that auditor. And so, but it does these types of things like Nest and FedRAMP and all these other ones. They certainly have a very significant impact on the way that we design, operate our cloud services. Thank you.
Hi, Patrick Lastenet from Interaction. Just going back on the data sovereignty issue, and specifically for Europe, you were quite innovative with your data trustee model in Germany. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on this and also outline whether it's more tactical solutions until things sort of settle down, or is this more of a strategic, more of a strategy for Europe where you want to deploy sort of specific agreements with data trustee providers in order to build that trust and give control to the customer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and might just take a minute to explain for those in the audience who may not know what the model that we're adopting in Germany as a first instance. And it's called a data trustee model. So it's a data center very similar to the ones that we design and build everywhere in the world. except that Microsoft's not operating it. It's operated by, in this case, a subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom. So it's German nationals. It's a Germany-based. It's German nationals operating it, and the reason behind it, I think, is partially it's looking at that there is a need and expectation for some customers, particularly for some workloads or some data sets, that they really do want to keep it sovereign. Health data is often in that realm. But it's part of the broader approach that we have, which is we want to cater to everybody's needs. And we have hybrid, we have everything from the public cloud through to the on-premise solution, and then variations in between. And this is just somewhere on that spectrum where it's about sort of enabling a certain set. Now, there is one thing that's important to understand. It's a more expensive model. There's a price premium to that. But there may well be demand, demand that will, because back to the benefits of the cloud and the strategic and economic benefits. If there's a data set or a workload that's just too sensitive to put in the public cloud, for example, this may well be a really viable option for our customers. And so we made that announcement a while back and building towards that one. Yes?
Hi there. Can you elaborate a little bit on the scenarios you were talking about, the legal challenges here in the U.S. about needing to provide information to the government without telling the people who own it?
No, there's actually been 4 legal challenges to the U.S. government, 3 of which are pretty much concluded and 1 that's ongoing. The first was in the wake of the Snowden revelations and us, we'd already been publishing a transparency report on the law enforcement requests that we get for data and the like. But we were prohibited in the national security sense to be able to do that about FISA court requests and the like. So we with others in industry challenged the U.S. government to allow us to be more transparent around that. And eventually the Justice Department agreed and gave some parameters for that. We can report in blocks of it's between 0 and 900 and 900 and 2,000 or whatever it is. But that was a successful case. There was another one where we were asked for data relating to an enterprise customer. And our policy is to redirect law enforcement to the enterprise customer because we don't know how to furnish the request. We're just the storer of the data. It's them that it should go to. And we were successful in that case as well. Then there was a third one, which was a cross-international one, which we call the warrant case. But it was a warrant in New York, which was seeking to get data from the Microsoft cloud relating to a customer whose data was in Europe, a non-US citizen whose data was in Europe. And what we were really standing up there for was to stand up for the principle that the same protections that you have in place in the analog world should apply in the digital world. So, for example, why should the printed copy of this email in this individual's house in a foreign country have more protection than the copy on the server? And the argument was from the U.S. government side, these were business records and we had the ability to hand them over, therefore we should. And again, we prevailed in that case. It went to an appeal. And then most recently, we have a case which is, again, it's a transparency thing, but it's also about being our right and ability to be able to inform customers of when there is a legal request for the data. Now, often there are situations where there is a gag order on that because revealing it to them, would tip them off that, their crimes are about to be busted. But what we noticed over time was that the gag orders on these were increasingly frequent and were unbound from a timing perspective. And so that's what this lawsuit is about, and we've recently just got a lot of support and amicus briefs from others in industry and civil society and et cetera to really try to curtail that and not have, there are places where that makes sense, and as a society we want that, but it really felt like the government was overusing this ability to put a gag order in place and not set a time limit on it. So that's the one that's more current and active right now. Yeah.
More questions?
Okay, well, I will wrap up with one final question for Brendon. I think we have about another few minutes in our time slide here. So Brendon, you're a Chief Privacy Officer for one of the largest technology companies in the world. That puts really on the front line. And we know all these things are coming down the pike. For example, in Europe, you've got the General Data Protection Regulation, which you mentioned. You've got Privacy Shield, which Max Schrems has assured us will be challenged in court. What are you going to spend the next 12 months what's going to be keeping you awake in this coming year?
I think in some ways, I know a lot of my counterparts around industry are going to be spending a lot of time on how do I reorient my program to meet these new European rules, and that's true of us as well. There are certain things that we've got to do. I think fortunate that there's been a lot of investment in privacy at Microsoft over the years. I'm actually the third Chief Privacy Officer, so I was lucky enough to inherit an already mature program when I joined, and so it's continual improvement. So, we've got time. Some of these timelines are short, particularly if you've got to make system changes and things like that. May 2018 will come around pretty quickly. So that's certainly got a lot of my attention to make sure that we do all what we need to do, not only to achieve our own compliance, but back to our cloud and our enterprise customers. What do we need to do and what can we do to help our enterprise customers? So that'll be a lot of focus. I think the other broad theme for me is just the pace of change, back to where I began this talk. And when you think about things like doing a privacy review to make sure that a new data collection or a new data use is in line with our values and our policies and our principles, the ability to kind of take some time to do that review is disappearing quickly. And what it leads to, I think, is a shift in the approach, a little bit more emphasis on how do we create broader awareness, how do we create more of the cultural element so people just know what the rules are when they're doing this. Targeting particular communities. We've got a lot of data scientists at Microsoft. How can we inform them in a way to go and do all the cool work they're doing, but also to be cognizant of where they might run afoul of our privacy policies. So it happens more organically and by design. So I think those are a few of the focus areas for me.